Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is about the Transatlantic undersea cable. Normally on Mega Projects, I like to say that we cover, skyscrapers, the International Space Station, things that people are definitely aware of and can see. But then I realized we don't. We really cover the hidden things anyway, so this is kind of par for the course. But with that said, let's just jump into it, shall we? Before the internet, before smartphones, before even those old-fashioned phones that you had to rotate the numbers to dial, a friend of mine's parents had one of those growing up. I grew up in the 90s. It was even weird back then. Even before all of those things, there was a form of communication that changed everything. No longer were humans constrained by another human physically taking a message to a different location. The telegraph revolutionized how we communicate. What would take days or even weeks could now be sent in a matter of hours or even minutes. But our story today is focused on one particularly groundbreaking project, because that's what we do here at Mega Projects. We do projects. On the 16th of August 1858, the world's first transatlantic telegraph message made its way through a cable stretching over 2,000 miles from the Irish coast to Newfoundland at Canada's edge. Today, we barely think about such a possibility, but 162 years ago, it was nothing short of revolutionary. While Samuel Morse gets most of the credit for the invention of the telegraph, he was not alone. Several other inventors made significant steps during the 1830s and 1840s, but it was Morse who patented the electric telegraph in 1837, so he kinda gets all of the credit. By transmitting electrical signals through wires connected to two separate stations, the world of communication was forever altered, and today, of course, we know this as Morse code. In fact, that's probably why you've heard of Morse. Even if you didn't know he invented the telegraph, you've probably heard of Morse code. Anyway, Morse sent his first telegraph message on the 24th of May, 1844 between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It read, "What hath God wrought?" A phrase taken from the Bible, if there was any doubt about that. There wasn't. The telegraph quickly spread throughout the United States, and in less than a decade, over 20,000 miles of cable had been connected across the country. Unsurprisingly, considering how we crave speed and efficiency today, it was pretty hugely popular. By 1861, the first transcontinental wire stretched across the United States, installed by Western Union, while over in Europe, particularly in Britain and France, a web of telegraph connections was slowly emerging. But there remained the problem of how these two continents could communicate quickly. Today, we can send messages across the Atlantic in the blink of an eye. In fact, way faster than the blink of an eye. It is at the speed of light, pretty much. It has become so simple it's easy to forget how extraordinarily difficult this was before 1858. First of all, you had to write a letter, and who even does that these days? Then it had to be transported across the ocean, a journey of at least 10 days. Then it had to be distributed to its recipient. The standard postal delivery time from London to New York in the 1850s was 12 days. Throw in a bad storm and that would surge upwards. A message to more remote areas of the United States might take months. You probably wanted to get your wedding RSVPs out a couple of years in advance then, just to be sure. In 1861, successful underwater telegraph cables had been laid between the UK and France and the UK and Ireland, but the Atlantic would be an entirely different proposition because it's absolutely massive. Morse had stated his case for a transatlantic submarine cable as early as 1841, but the earliest attempts in the early 1850s were simply to connect Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. American businessman Cyrus Westfield thought this idea was onto something, and despite knowing absolutely nothing about telegraph cables, or for that matter the Atlantic Ocean, he took up the cause with remarkable vigor. After consulting with oceanographers, he believed a feasible route across the Atlantic existed. They were so certain that the route had provisionally been named Telegraph Plateau. This route would not connect the UK to the USA, but rather Ireland to Canada, Newfoundland to be exact. Not only was this the shortest route across the Atlantic, makes sense, but it would also avoid the more rugged underwater terrain that lay south of Telegraph Plateau. In 1856, the link between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland was completed at a cost of $1 million, which is just over $30 million today. Meanwhile, Cyrus Westfield was busying himself over in the UK, which was the only place producing a large amount of submarine cable at the time. He ordered 2,500 miles of the cable from Gutta Percha Company, and in October of 1856 he formed the Atlantic Telegraph Company. Both the British and American governments made financial contributions to the project, while the sale of company stocks boosted the budget further. The cable being produced for the project needed to be armored separately, meaning to place a protective casing around. As you might expect for 2,500 miles worth of cable, this was an absolutely mountainous project in itself, and was completed by two separate companies, Glass Elliott & Co. and R.S. Newell & Company. Things got off to a slightly embarrassing start when it was found towards the end of manufacturing that the two companies had been twisting their strands in opposite directions. Now that might not sound like a significant problem, but it meant that the wire couldn't be directly spliced together because it would just unravel. Fortunately, this was relatively easily fixed with an improvised wooden bracket, but the fiasco had certainly damaged the young company's reputation even before the cable had been laid. Although, wasn't there that satellite, or there was a Mars rover or something that was sent there, and it just didn't work because they used the wrong units? Like someone used imperial and someone used metric. So don't worry too much, cable guys. You did okay. The cable that would reside under the Atlantic Ocean consisted of 7 copper wires, each weighing 107 pounds per nautical mile, or 26 kilometers per kilogram. It was covered with 3 coats of gutta percha, which was non-conductive sap from the Palaquium grouping of trees, and it was wound with tarred hemp, over which a sheath of 18 strands, each of 7 iron wires, and wrapped in a helix pattern, corkscrew-shaped, completed the cable. It weighed nearly 1.1 tons per nautical mile, that's 550 kilograms per kilometer, but considering its weight, it was relatively flexible, capable of withstanding a pull of several tons of pressure. If you expect that this was done quickly, I am going to stop you right there. This was a rocky ride all the way through. Discussions had taken place as to the best way to lay the cable. Should a ship sail west with the cable on board, or should 2 ships make their way to the middle and then splice their cables together and then travel back in opposite directions? For the first attempt at least, the first option was taken. 1 boat. The cable began near Ballacabary Castle in Southern Ireland with 2 vessels, HMS Agamemnon and USS Niagara, both borrowed from their respective governments, waiting offshore. The 2 ships were needed because the 2,500 nautical miles of cable was just too big for 1 ship to carry alone. The cable broke on the first day, but was grappled and quickly repaired. As the ships headed west, things started to look promising, but once again, the cable snapped, and this time it disappeared below the waves, probably ending up around 2 miles, 1.6 kilometers underwater. A total of 300 miles of cable had been lost in an instant, and the operation was abandoned for the time being at a cost of £225,000, which is about £14 million today. Can you imagine the guy on the boat where the cable just falls off? He's like, shit. The following year, they tried again, this time with an improved braking mechanism for the cable. Much of the early problems had come from the difficulties in regulating tension on the cable, but trials had shown this new method to be successful, and this time, both ships would move in opposite directions from a central point. On June 10, 1858, the 2 ships once again donned their hefty cargo and sailed clear of the Irish coast. 10 days in, a furious storm tore through the area, battering the 2 vessels and injuring many on board. Both boats were so top-heavy that they faced the very real danger of capsizing, but neither did, and on the 25th of June, they arrived at the midway point. The 2 cables were spliced together, and both boats began moving gingerly away from each other. The Agamemnon moved east towards Ireland, and the Niagara west towards Newfoundland, but again, it didn't go well. The vast cable broke 3 separate times, after 3 nautical miles, 5.5 kilometers, 54 nautical miles, 100 kilometers, and lastly, when the 2 boats were 200 nautical miles, 370 kilometers apart. Once again, work was paused, and the boats returned to Ireland. Even just thinking about this endeavor is maddeningly frustrating, so we can only imagine what it must have been like for those involved. But nothing worth doing was ever easy, and this was certainly something worth doing. Discord was brewing within the Atlantic Telegraph Company. Some directors had had enough and were looking to cut their losses by selling off the cable and abandoning the project altogether. Only the blind determination of Cyrus Westfield kept the project afloat. So what do they say about third time being the charm? The ships departed once again on the 17th of July, and by the 28th of July the cables had been spliced together in the middle of the ocean. The 2 ships again set course for their respective continents. And would you know it? Everything went well. Well, Sort of. Most importantly, the cable did not break, but both boats did veer wildly off course because their compasses were affected by the electrically charged cable on board. This was addressed by each having a small pilot boat leading the way. The Niagara arrived in Trinity Bay in Newfoundland on the 4th of August, and the following day the cable was brought ashore and attached to the cable house. That same day, the Agamemnon arrived in Valentia Island, where the cable was brought ashore at Knightstown. Short test messages went back and forth over the next few days to ascertain the reliability before announcing it to the world. On the 16th of August, the world's first official telegraph message whizzed across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, and it read, "Directors of Atlantic Telegraph Company, Great Britain, to directors in America. Europe and America are united by telegraph. Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill towards men." But some important people also wanted to have their say. A telegram message from Queen Victoria was sent to President James Buchanan, in which she hoped that the cable would prove to be an additional link between the nations whose friendship is founded on their common interest and reciprocal esteem. The president responded in a much more flowery manner by saying, "It is a triumph most glorious because it is far more useful to mankind than was ever won by conquerors on the field of battle. May the Atlantic Telegraph, under the blessing of heaven, prove to be a bond of perpetual peace and friendship between the kindred nations, and an instrument destined by divine providence to diffuse religion, civilization, liberty, and law throughout the world." Very flowery, Mr. Buchanan. That sounds wonderful, but do spare a thought for the poor guy who has to decipher it. Unfortunately, the signal was so bad that it took an average of 2 minutes and 5 seconds to just send a single character. Victoria's entire message was only 98 words long and took a staggering 17 hours to transmit at a plodding rate of 0.1 words per minute. The public response was overwhelming. New York held a 100-gun salute in its honor. It's got to be better than 21 guns, right? While one of the major players on the project, Charles Tilston Bright, was knighted in Britain for his service. Surely this is where it all rides off into the glorious sunset of success. But no. Just 3 weeks later, the cable broke, and it all came down to the law of squares. Have you never heard of it? Well, neither had we, but it states that the current injected into the cable reaches a maximum at a time proportional to the square of the distance down the line. In more simplistic terms, the distance was too far for the cable to be used, and the voltage sent down it in the first few weeks was too high. The insulation surrounding the wires was simply not enough for the 2000 volts, and to make matters worse, several sections of the line were found to be corrupted. The response to such a high-profile failure after such joyous celebrations was fierce, with some even claiming that the whole thing had been a hoax. Wow, couple of things there. Conspiracy theories have always been around. And two, can you imagine having this technology, being able to communicate across the Atlantic in, 17 hours for a message, but compared to the weeks, or, week plus for a message before, it'd be like going back to dial-up. Or teletext. But Cyrus Westfield was eager to get started on a second attempt, yet after the failure of the first, trust and motivation was pretty low. It wasn't until 1864 that he raised the capital needed for a second cable. By this point, long cables had been laid below the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and with this added knowledge, some important design alterations were added. This time, the copper was coated with Chatterton's compound, an adhesive waterproofing compound that had been created in 1859, followed by 4 layers of gutta percha. The core was then covered with hemp, which had first been saturated in a preservative solution. The hemp contained 18 single strands of high-tensile steel wire. Each of these wires was also covered with fine strands of manila yarn, itself heavy in preservative. Now, when you first think about, laying a cable underwater, you think of cables you know. This is a lot more complicated and contains a lot of weird stuff. In total, this second cable weighed twice as much as the first, at around 4,000 pounds per nautical mile, or 980 kilograms a kilometer. This time, the process would use only one ship, the Great Eastern, which had been purposefully fitted to be able to accommodate the 2,300 miles of cable on board. On the 15th of July, 1867, the Great Eastern steamed clear of the Irish coast, and all was going well. 1,062 miles, 1,709 kilometers had been paid out when the cable snapped and it disappeared beneath the water. Initial efforts to recover it failed, and the Great Eastern made its way home. Now, I know I keep going on about tenacity and perseverance in this video, but you've got to give it to them here. The following year, on the 18th of July 1866, the refitted vessel once again left Ireland, and despite running into some pretty nasty weather, landed the cable in Newfoundland on the 27th of July. Once again, there was a fully functioning transatlantic cable running under the Atlantic. So, surely that is it. But amazingly, and, well, maybe not surprisingly, it wasn't. That August, the Great Eastern, along with several other ships, set sail with the hope of finding the cable that had been lost the year before. The odds of them finding it were slim. Actually, we're probably being a bit optimistic here. It was incredibly unlikely they would find it. But this is just that kind of story. Despite only having rough coordinates, they succeeded in finding a cable on the ocean floor about 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers down, simply by using grappling hooks at the end of long ropes. How is that even possible? It's incredibly lucky. Imagine the joy of the crew as it appeared. Now imagine walking in the morning to find that the cable had seemingly slipped from the ship and disappeared once again. It sounds ludicrous. It does indeed. Once again, they found the cable though, and this time they took 26 hours to get it safely onto the Great Eastern. Secure with its precious cargo, the ship steamed for Newfoundland, arriving on the 7th of September. The world had waited so long for a transatlantic cable, and now there were 2 of them. And that is where this extraordinary tale of Victorian-era ingenuity and bloody-mindedness comes to an end. Numerous more cables were laid in the coming decades, and by the end of the 19th century, there was a complex web of telegraph cables owned by the British, French, Germans, and Americans stretching across the Atlantic. But of course, it went much further than that. By the 1890s, submarine cables stretched to every continent, and in 1902, a cable was laid beneath the Pacific Ocean, which completed the circumnavigation of the world by the telegraph. So let's just take a moment with that fact. In less than 50 years, we had moved from letters carried on ships to most parts of the world communicating by telegraph. It was a truly astonishing period. The transatlantic telegraph cable boosted trade between Europe and North America. A report in 2018 suggested the cable alone had been responsible for an 8% rise in total trade. The cable laid in 1866 was significantly faster than its earlier cousin and was now able to send 8 words per minute. That sounds painful to think about now, but back then it was monumental, and the speed that business could be conducted was never again the same. In the early stages at least, the cost meant that it was mainly government and big businesses that used the service. At $10 or $161 per word today, it was certainly pricey. Of course, the use of the telegraph has faded into history now. The service was in decline by the 1920s as the telephone began to take hold. Interestingly, Western Union, who, if you remember, was a key player in the telegraph business, gave up its patent battle with Alexander Graham Bell because they considered their telegraph service to be better than the telephone. But they probably regretted that one. By the 1930s and 1940s, it had come to the end of the road in terms of wide public use, but it was still regularly used to distribute news feeds from agencies until the 1990s, when something called the internet came along. The story of the transatlantic telegraph cable has everything you want in an old-fashioned tale of groundbreaking engineering, and it's perfect for a megaprojects video. It's got audacity, adventure, and more than a little of the absurd. Make no mistake about it, the telegraph revolutionized the way we communicate in much the same way the internet has done today. The cable running beneath the cold Atlantic waters for over 2,000 miles meant that 2 people on 2 different continents could communicate for the very first time. This was a pioneering achievement that, quite simply, changed the world. So this has been Mega Projects. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I found this super interesting. I love the ones where it's like you don't expect it to be incredibly cool. Like a giant skyscraper, you're like, it's gonna be pretty awesome. But a wire beneath the sea? Who knew? I mean, I knew it was gonna be cool, but this cool? Who knew? Thank you for watching. Smash that like button if you did and you watched it all the way to the end. So, you know, you probably did. And like I always say, unless you hate watched it, in that case, feel free to dislike. Thanks for watching.